Hey folks, welcome to another episode of 5 to 15 with Musickers. I'm your host, Jason DeCristofaro, and I'm here with a legend in the music industry. I love what he said before we started today's interview. We were just chatting and talking about some experiences he had. He said, I've done pretty much everything and will do pretty much everything in the music industry, and correct me if I'm wrong here, except for lights and pushing cases up ramps.
That's it, man. I don't do road work.
I love it. Everyone, Michael Selverne. Michael, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Jason. Good to see you, man. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. Yeah. Now, you've done, again, as I mentioned, pretty much everything. I mean, you're a guitarist, you're a songwriter. I could go down the list. But we only have a little bit of time, so what I want to focus on is specifically the intersection between your work as a producer and a publisher. I guess first, can you just tell our viewers a little bit about what a producer does, just sort of a quick elevator pitch on what does a producer do, and then a quick elevator pitch on what a publisher does.
Sure. A producer, and this I have to attribute this back to Lenny Kaye, the guitarist and producer for Patti Smith, among others. I heard this from Lenny when I must have been about 24, 25. And this is what I believe to be the case. A producer is the person that takes an artist's vision and realizes it with the artist. Takes it from concept to realization. And if as an artist you don't have an exact vision, the producer is the person that helps you construct that vision and then implement it. And in implementing it, I mean hiring musicians, creating arrangements, deciding if there's an orchestra, what the constituency of the band is going to be, means of recording, everything that is involved in taking something from its idea until it's pressed into vinyl. So that's how I view production. I'm sure there are people who have different take on that. A music publisher, going back to the really old days, is someone that finds songs and finds uses for those songs. So connects a piece of work to an artist that is capable of realizing the work. I Will Always Love You, which most people know as Whitney Houston from The Bodyguard, was actually written by Dolly Parton and originally recorded by Dolly Parton. It was Kevin Costner, the star of the film and producer, who was aware of the composition and brought it to the film and brought it to Whitney. So in that instance, you would say that Kevin was its publisher.
Interesting.
So those are two things that I've done a lot of in the world. I was a part of, we created notation music in the early 90s. I worked with Mike Caren creating Artist Publisher Group. We worked with Nat Geo on their publishing. And then we worked with Matt Pincus and founded Songs Music Publishing, which was a significant independent publisher. We signed Lord, we signed Diplo. I worked with Willard Adretz and we founded Cobalt Publishing in America. Cobalt is to this day one of the largest, best known publishers in America. And then in 2010, I started to work with a fellow called Josh Gruss, also a musician, and we formed Roundhill Music Publishing, which is still very much in existence and does music publishing, records, record production, anything that takes musical elements and creates something bigger from them.
Well, here's my question is, how does one actually get into publishing? Because I think for a lot of musicians, a lot of people who are performers, I mean, you're a guitarist yourself, they're probably thinking of a publisher as like, oh, this is somebody like up there, an administrative person, ivory tower. How did you get into the publishing world?
You know, when I was 23, I was studying music in New York with a guy called Edgar Grana. And Edgar's other students were Mike Brecker, John Faddis, Peter Erskine,
Wow.
David Sanborn. There were 3 or 4 of us that were not luminaries. And in working with Edgar had a particular focus on songs, songwriting, not so much just the articulation of music, but its overall creation. And when I got to know a lot of those guys, Michael and Randy and Peter, I started to have this appreciation for the composition, right? When you're in music school, at least for me, I thought a lot about playing, and I thought about notes and how the Hoptamon major scale worked, and things like that, and what you would play over what change. This notion that these great, great, great players, these super refined virtuosos, were really thinking about their compositions. They were thinking about the notes that went into the songs and created the base for them to create music. And that was when I started to meet people that were music publishers from around the world, was through them, and people who had this tremendous appreciation for songs and wanted to know about the songs. And all of a sudden, it was no longer the record. It was, well, do you have a demo? Can I hear the demo of the songs? So, that was it. It created a love in me for what songwriters do, and why ultimately there was a t-shirt I used to have from Universal Records that said, if you don't have a song, you don't have shit. And
it's true, though. It's true.
I've come to believe that that is the truth.
Yeah.
Right?
So you were coming from this perspective, entering this world of publishing, which is, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the business side, maybe the part people don't know as much about. But you were coming from the position of a instrumentalist, a guitarist who loved to just play, and also somebody who loved to compose and wanted to just create music. So to me, that's really important, I think, is not losing sight of that. But so now you're in this world, and I guess this is in the late 70s, 80s?
This is probably early to mid 80s, yeah.
Early to mid 80s, okay. And what are some of the things that you discovered when you entered the publishing world that were perhaps new, or things that you didn't learn in school, or things that you weren't expecting?
I think probably the first thing I learned was the impact of people that were just songwriters. They were instrumentalists to some greater or lesser degrees. Some of them didn't really play much at all. A woman called Allie Willis, who wrote Neutron Dance. She wrote September for Earth, Wind and Fire.
Wow, okay.
She wrote the theme for Friends, for the Rembrandts.
Yeah.
Allie Willis was not an instrumentalist.
Huh.
She was not a musician. She could think about music. She could hear melody. She could tie melody to lyrics. And that was a profound realization, that you didn't even have to be an instrumentalist to be able to visualize and to create something that was so powerful. And that's where the notion of producing, which I really started, I guess, also in the early 80s, came into play. Was it doesn't have to be you that you produce. It doesn't have to be your song. It doesn't have to be your band.
Right.
When you find a great song, if you find a great artist that should sing that song, then the conversation turns to, how do you marry those two things? How do you make something great out of great raw ingredients? And then you start to step into the role of the producer.
Yeah.
And figuring out how to wire that together.
That's really cool, because to your point, there's sort of the right artist for the right song, I would imagine, in every instance.
It was when I got into the business, Jason, you had songwriters, you had musicians, you had producers, you had engineers. And there was a lot of segmentation. What has happened through the democratization of music via technology is now everyone is their own writer, their own producer, their own band, and their own engineer.
Yeah.
And I think you could see the results of that, which is we do not produce artists with long sustained careers. We are not producing records in many instances that you would say are musically innovative or sophisticated. As a friend of mine likes to say, you get the right sequencer, you use Ableton, you push middle C, and a bunch of shit just happens. You hard wall limit that and print it, and there's your record.
Yeah.
Not the same art that people like Phil Ramone employed when he would go out and hire Rob Mounsey to arrange strings, Peter Schwartz to create keyboard parts. He was meticulous about every element that went into his record. It had to meet his vision, which was consistent with the artist's vision. And so, like photographers, like a lot of other things that have suffered, I think, through the democratization of art and technology, the creation of music is one of them.
Well, and you've been in this industry, you mentioned earlier, for 44 years. I mean, that's almost half a century. So, I mean, you've seen, like you mentioned, this change. I guess two questions. First, when did you start to see this change happen? And then secondly, now it's 2024. What direction do you see it taking from this point forward?
Um, so it started to change in 1984. Nick Rhodes was on the cover of Keyboard magazine with a quote Poly 800, and I scraped up, I don't know how much money it was, but I screwed my landlord. I was late on my rent, and I went and got one of these things because it had a built-in step sequencer.
Now, what is a step sequencer?
Oh, a
for
step
viewers?
sequencer is just, it allows you to create patterns of music, but you have to do it based on the smallest time increment. So if you're going to use 16th notes, then you have to start. So if you're programming a whole note, you have to program 16 steps on that one note to create a whole note.
Right.
So you have to be very conscious of time and how to break it down on a step sequencer. It was a very elemental device.
It seems like such a contrast because just a minute or so ago you mentioned how you can basically hit middle C and just all these things are automatically generated. That's such a contrast where you have to be cognizant of the rhythmic framework.
This was 1984. It was the very early days.
Yeah.
And of course I had a Yamaha RX 15 drum machine.
Yeah.
And the keyboard and the drum machine spoke over MIDI. And this for me was the first really wild realization of technology, right? I could program a bass line on my little Korg.
Yeah.
And it would sync up with my little drum machine. And all of a sudden, we had a band going in my crappy studio apartment.
Right.
And that was really elemental. About 4 years later, a friend of mine went on vacation and loaned me his Apple Mac 2E, that little box with the monochrome screen, and it had their music program in it.
Yeah.
And that was like my really first exposure, that and Synclavier, to direct to disc recording.
Yeah.
And that was the shit that the Fairlight and the Synclavier were really the first direct to digital disc recording. That's where it started, and then you had the advent of early Pro Tools.
Now, when did Pro Tools show up?
Really, it was sometime probably in or about the very late 80s.
Okay.
Very early 90s.
And it's still around. It's still sort of an industry standard, which is incredible.
It's
the longevity of it.
A lot of the young people these days use Ableton.
Sure.
It has certain flexibilities. It has time flexibility. So if you've got time issues in Pro Tools, you use tools like Beat Detective.
Yeah.
Or you have to listen out to where parts are not aligned and physically align them, where Ableton will actually take loops and time correct them for you. So it's that democratization of technology again.
Anybody can do this, right? Well, so that brings us, I guess, back to when you started to see these things change. We started talking about that a little bit. So I guess really, it's not quite as recent. It's all the way back in '84. It sounds like that was the beginning of what we're seeing today.
That's what I would say. For me, it was. That was my realization.
And so what direction? I mean, it's 2024, and as you mentioned, there's so many people doing it in their basements or their apartments. They have all the tools, and they can hold all those roles simultaneously in terms of the engineer, be the musician, being the writer. Do you see that trend continuing, and do you see any new trends? Do you have any predictions for things maybe that we aren't hearing about right now?
I think that's a hard one. I think there are some people who appreciate old style of recording.
Yeah.
Sitting behind me is an analog API 1608 console.
Yeah.
It's very much like the API consoles of the 1970s. It has a beautiful sound. It has a lot of headroom. So when things are coming off tape, if it hits the console, you don't hear digital noise. You get overtone series, right?
Right.
When you exceed the threshold in Pro Tools, you get noise.
Right.
So you want to be careful about that. But I think the good and the bad of democratization of technology, the bad is that you get a lot of crap.
Yeah.
So there will be 50,000 records that will be uploaded today and tomorrow and every other day this year.
Yeah.
And there'll be 2 million records uploaded this year, where we used to release 25,000 albums in a year. So the market's saturated. It makes discovery very difficult. It shrouds some great music with a lot of crap.
Yeah.
But the positive in that is that conceptual artists like Allie Willis, that are able to hear, that have these visions, now no longer need to spend $1,500 a day on a studio and a group of musicians
Yep.
and a producer. So I think that it allows people with great minds
Yeah.
this tool and this ability to create great work more easily, more effortlessly. And my hope for the future is, though I think we're in a bit of a trough of the wave, being a musician has become very cool. Someone interviewed Blondie and she said, you know, we were a band when being in a band meant you were the bad kids. She said, now everybody's got a fucking band.
Oh, I see.
Like it means nothing.
Right. They're a dime a dozen.
But that may wear off. And hopefully what will remain is people who are emotionally committed to the art.
Yeah.
And who now find that their lives have been made much easier and their ability to translate their ideas is almost instantaneous. And maybe in that process, we start to discover the next Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven,
Yeah. Allie Willis.
Allie Willis.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so much wisdom, so much insight here. I cannot thank you enough. I know this is, I think, really important information for musicians, especially young musicians, to hear. So, Michael, thank you so much for your
Jason,
time.
thank you. It's a pleasure, man.
Likewise.
And thank you for your constant love and dedication to this craft, because I know you're always learning, you're always teaching, and you're always out there doing.
Likewise. We all have to.
And that's what creates the shoulders for young musicians to stand on. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thanks to you all for tuning in.
So, real quick before we go, where can people learn more about your music? Do you have a website? Do you have...
welcome-to, the word to-mars.com is my website. There's a bunch of information there. And God knows in this day and age, if you Google me, all sorts of crap will likely pop up.
I love it. Michael, thank you so much. Y'all have a great day.